For 7 weeks, the lone park ranger serial killer terrorized Charleston by going to the city parks downtown and killing white adult males who went to the parks to walk late at night. The ages of the males was 29 to 55. He left evidence every time he killed someone. One time he even left a knife that he used to kill somebody. The killings were excessively violent, seemed more like rage than execution. He left the bodies. He didn't position them in any way. The murders differed greatly. He used both handguns and he used knives. And there were different intervals of cooling off time between his killings. Sometimes there was 2 days, sometimes there was a week. After they had enough accumulated forensic evidence, they arrested him, found out he lived at the Charleston Authority Housing Apartments. And they couldn't find any family, and he said he didn't have any, and they had no friends nearby either. The apartment neighbors said he was kind of a weird guy, an odd guy, and has had really poor hygiene, and he was just sort of emotionally immature and kind of socially awkward with them. In the apartment, they found some of the victims' belongings, not a lot, but at least one from every victim. And they also found some notebooks where he had been writing down his fantasies, and they had gotten more and more violent as he went on. He said he went after the white males because those are the kind of people that belittled him, humiliated him, bullied him all his life, rejected him all his life, and so he wanted to get back at them. Now, Dr. Galuski and Dr. Hickey, if they were profilers, they would say this was a disorganized serial killer because he had no advanced planning. He had opportunistic kills. The crime scenes were crazy, chaotic. He left the bodies where he murdered them. He didn't try to hide anything. He didn't care about the forensic evidence. He didn't care about leaving the bodies. Dr. Hickey also mentioned that he was so excessive in his violence that he knew it was a rage, that he seemed like he was a little bit of isolated and he couldn't get employed and stuff, and he had a sort of psychologically unstable when they interviewed him, and he had very poor impulse control. Now, a profiler who would look at him would think also that he was a power control serial killer because he had no practical motive for the murders. He wasn't going for revenge for that specific person, although he was revenging himself on a group of people. But there was no political objectives. There was no money or sex involved whatsoever. I think he was murdering just to overcome feelings of inadequacy and powerlessness. And he wanted to dominate and control now, and he was in control at the murder scenes. It was emotionally rewarding to him to be in control. He wrote in his books that he wanted to be the king or the god or, the boss of people. Murder seemed to temporarily relieve his angst about these feelings. His deep feelings of inadequacy and low self-esteem, though, did come out. In summary, Dr. Hicks's typology and Dr. Galuka's video lectures would classify the lone park ranger killer as a disorganized but a controlled serial killer because he had opportunistic victim selection. He had poor planning because he had chaotic crime scenes. He'd had failure to conceal the bodies and left a lot of forensic evidence around. He seemed emotionally excessive in his killings and very violent. He seemed socially isolated from other people and had sort of psychological dysfunction. Now, the control part comes in on what his intention was to kill these people. And because it was not burglary or robbery or it was not for sex or any kind of thrill, or it wasn't a political thing, he said he was just motivated by the desire to have power control over men he thought had belittled him all his life. He also was a white male and around 35 years old. Now, the Hickey's trauma control model talks about serial killers and how they develop through multiple factors, starting as a child. And so we're starting at the child, and we're going to go around the circle of the trauma control model, the TECM. Of course, it starts with traumatic childhood experiences, like abuse, neglect, dysfunctional families, such as parents divorce, or there's a death or suicide, or the parents have mental illness or drug or alcohol abuse, or one of the parents might have been locked up. But Dr. Hickey added that the child could have this failure to succeed, like in school, or be ostracized at school, or be excluded from his peer group and stuff like that, as well as those other childhood traumas. Hickey also said that trauma is paired with these predispositional factors of the child, like did he have brain problems? A lot of them have head injuries. Was he involved with alcohol and drugs as a child? Did he look at pornography as he grew? Did he have any learning disabilities or developmental problems? Was he impulsive? Was he emotionally unstable? Did he have genetic variations? Dr. Hickey mentioned people that had males that had extra Y chromosome. So anyway, the child started feeling these feelings of rejection from his family and from his peers, and he had an inability to cope with this kind of stress. And so he starts fantasizing, this real gentle fantasizing about he could be a powerful person, and he fantasized himself, being in groups and bossing people around and stuff. And then his fantasies became a reward, and so they became reinforcement for themselves. Now, Hicks says this is when dissociation might occur. Now, Dr. Galuska didn't mention this, but when the dissociation occurs, it's when the child is overwhelmed by anxiety, and they can even fake self-confidence or completely suppress or black out any traumatic event in their lives. Now, he's living in his fantasy and it leads to social isolation, because the fantasy is more fun for him than the real world. He begins having a distrust of people, wanting to stay in his own mind. Therefore, he had a lack of empathy for other people. And of course, his poor social relationships did not help at all. So he chooses the fantasy world, and they let the child be relieved from his feelings of inadequacy, self-doubt. But the child is viewing the world in a real distorted kind of way, where as it's a threatening place, it's an unfair place, and so it's sort of distorted. His fantasies start becoming increasingly violent, maybe as he grows into an older child. But since they are an escape from painful reality, it's a place where the child wants to continue to stay because he feels powerful there and in control, where he begins to start now violently taking revenge in his fantasies on people. Now, the fantasies become increasingly emotionally rewarding and reinforce themselves because the child gets temporary relief from his sense and a sense of worthiness that relieves him from feeling so unworthy. Fantasies become better than real life, and that way they're still reinforcing themselves. Kind of a catch-22. Fantasies are something that he's living in now instead of just living in real life. We know that all life has stressors, but at one point in time, probably a stressor got to him. Something that happened to him got to him, and since he had never learned to cope with these significant stressors, it kind of triggers him to move on to a little bit more significant first killing. Maybe he just goes and watches the park for a while and decides that's what he's going to do, and then he begins carrying weapons, not doing anything, and then he starts actually killing people. Some of the stressors he probably had was relationship conflicts, a job loss, of course, no family, that's a stressor, conflict with neighbors, I heard. He had some major life changes, and maybe even just daily frustrations of life. Now, those fantasies are facilitated by factors that reduce self-control and lessen inhibitions. So as he got older, probably could get a hold of alcohol and drugs. Maybe he used pornography, but he continued to socially isolate himself. And these facilitators could lead to chronic antisocial behavior, diminished empathy, and even neurological impairment in this gentleman. So you have a cycle: predisposition, vulnerabilities, reduced reliance on life. Then you have severe childhood trauma that produces feelings of helplessness and low self-esteem and, being rejected. And then the low self-esteem and the being rejected and the poor socialization lead him to do low self-esteem fantasies where he becomes someone in his fantasies. And then that low self-esteem fantasies, especially with facilitators and trauma, they reinforce themselves and become eventually more and more violent as he wants to get back at the people he feels that are hurting him. Fantasies don't cut it anymore, and then the child, or if they've aged, the young adult, they're triggered by a life stressor that they have. It's something that maybe somebody else, a normal person, could just, let them roll off their back. But he gets triggered and he goes out and starts stalking and just watching the parks. And the fantasies that are violent become even more violent, and they become violent behavior, such as murder. Now, the murder he does temporarily relieves him and restores a sense of his control, while it also reinforces his violent fantasies. So he continues, so the cycle repeats, and it has to repeat if you're going to be a serial killer. Overall, TCM is multifactorial. It has to be a weird combination of biological, psychological, developmental, and environmental factors. An overall majority of abused, traumatized, or even violently fantasizing children don't become violent offenders. Both Dr. Galuska said that quite often. Maybe it's because they got some support somewhere along the way. Maybe some mental health professional treated them. Maybe they had a positive relationship at one time, or maybe they just got a good education or learned better coping skills, or they just started using their brain in positive ways. Whatever Dr. Galusi brings up the fact that TCM, and I thought this was really important, should not be used as a prediction that immediately leads to serial murders. Instead, it should be used as a framework for understanding the risk and development of a serial murderer. Galuska said that the TCM is not this is important. It's not a prospective approach research, but it's a based on looking back retrospective case studies. Therefore, it's better for understanding common patterns of serial killers than it is for predicting who's going to be a serial killer. Besides, many of the concepts in Hickey's trauma control model can't be measured objectively. How do you measure fantasies? That's what I have. Have a good evening.